Police officers are trained to expect the unexpected: car chases, investigations, moments of intense danger. But sometimes, the most unsettling experiences aren't about criminals or immediate threats. They come from the unknown, the things you can't explain. In today's video, you'll hear a chilling story about a routine patrol on a remote road that turned into something unforgettable. Get ready for a tale that will leave you questioning what's out there in the dark. My name is Ethan Marlowe. I've been a police officer for almost 10 years, and as you might imagine, I've seen a bit of everything during my shifts. But no matter how much experience you have, some things catch you off guard, and you never quite shake them off. Today, I'll share a night that completely changed how I see my job, and even people in general. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the cold bites at your skin but is still bearable. I was on patrol in a small, quiet town surrounded by forests and open fields. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, and neighbors know everything about one another. My partner, a younger officer named Ryan, had taken the night off, so I was working solo. Around midnight, a call came in over the radio. A resident on the edge of town reported hearing screams coming from an abandoned house along a dirt road. The house was one of those infamous local landmarks, old, crumbling, and with just enough history to spark ghost stories. Teenagers used to hang out there for parties or dares, but over the last few months, it had fallen completely silent. No one talked about it anymore. I drove out to the location, the dirt road jarring the patrol car as it hit every pothole. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating towering trees that seemed to close in on me like the walls of a tunnel. Finally, the house came into view at the end of the road. It was exactly as the stories described, 2 stories tall, its wooden frame rotting and paint long faded to a grayish hue. The windows were shattered, and ivy had crept up most of the walls. The whole place radiated a sense of decay, like it had been forgotten by time. I parked the car a good distance away and stepped out into the silence. There were no other cars, no signs of anyone nearby. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots as I approached the house. Pulling out my flashlight, I scanned the area. At first, it seemed deserted, just an old house falling apart in the woods. But then I noticed something, a faint glow coming from one of the upstairs windows. It was dim, almost like candlelight, and it flickered irregularly. My instincts kicked in. Either someone was squatting in the house, or something else was going on. I radioed in my location and told dispatch I was investigating a possible trespassing situation. Backup wasn't immediately available. Small-town policing meant we were often stretched thin. So, I decided to check it out myself. As I approached the front door, the air felt heavier, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The inside of the house smelled of mildew and damp wood. My flashlight beam revealed broken furniture, graffiti on the walls, and piles of trash scattered across the floor. I called out, "This is the police. Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty rooms. No response. I moved cautiously, checking room by room. Most were empty, just filled with the debris of time and neglect. But as I made my way upstairs, the sense of unease grew stronger. The glow I'd seen earlier was coming from a room at the end of the hallway. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly open, and the flickering light cast long shadows on the hallway walls. My hand tightened around my flashlight as I nudged the door open with my other hand. The room was empty of furniture, but in the center was a makeshift altar of sorts. Candles, most of them burned down to stubs, surrounded a pile of photographs. The light from the candles cast distorted shadows that danced across the walls. I stepped closer to examine the photos, and my stomach dropped. They were all of the same woman, taken at different times, in different places. Some were candid, like someone had followed her and taken them without her knowing. Others were more recent, showing her inside her home, through her windows. I heard a faint creak behind me, and my heart skipped a beat. Spinning around, I shone my flashlight down the hallway, but it was empty. The house was silent again. I quickly radioed for backup, my voice steady but urgent. As I waited, I decided to head back downstairs and keep an eye on the exits. Whoever had been there couldn't have gone far. Before leaving the room, though, I noticed something else, a notebook lying next to the photos. I flipped it open, and what I saw made my skin crawl. It was filled with pages and pages of writing, obsessive notes about the woman, details about her daily routine, her favorite places, even the names of her family members. Backup arrived 20 minutes later. We searched the entire house and the surrounding woods, but we didn't find anyone. The woman in the photos was identified and contacted. She had no idea she was being watched. We never found out who had been in the house or how long they had been stalking her. To this day, I still think about that night. About how close we might have been to catching someone in the act, or worse, arriving too late. It reminded me that true fear doesn't come from the supernatural, it comes from the darkness that exists in people. My name is Nathan Cole. Being a police officer in a rural area means dealing with a strange mix of the mundane and the unusual. Most nights, it's quiet, traffic stops, the occasional domestic call, or maybe a wildlife complaint. But sometimes, the quiet is what makes things unsettling. That's what happened during a late shift about 6 years ago, a night I still think about whenever I'm out on those empty back roads. It was a Tuesday, just past 2 a.m. I was patrolling the outskirts of town, an area surrounded by fields and patches of dense woods. The kind of place where streetlights are scarce, and the only illumination comes from the moon and your headlights. Dispatch radioed in about a 911 hang-up call. The location was a small farmhouse on a gravel road a few miles out of town. The caller hadn't said anything, just dialed and hung up. We get those sometimes, kids playing with phones, pocket dials, things like that. But protocol meant I had to check it out. As I turned onto the gravel road, a fog had started to settle, and visibility was poor. My headlights barely cut through the thick mist. The farmhouse came into view after a few minutes, an old, two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. There were no lights on inside, and the whole place looked abandoned. I parked near the driveway and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my boots, the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. Even the usual nighttime noises, crickets, owls, seemed absent. Approaching the house, I noticed the front door was slightly open, just enough to make me uneasy. I called out, "This is the police. Is anyone here?" My voice carried into the fog, but there was no response. With my flashlight in one hand and my other resting on my holstered weapon, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked loudly under my weight. Peering inside, I saw an empty living room. Old furniture was draped with dusty sheets, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten decorations. It smelled like mildew and decay. "Police. If anyone's here, make yourself known." Still nothing. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my flashlight. The floorboards groaned with each step, and the air felt heavier the further I went. The silence was almost unbearable, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through the ground floor, an empty kitchen, a dining room with an old table covered in dust, and a narrow hallway leading to a set of stairs. Everything looked untouched, like no one had lived there in years. As I was about to head upstairs, I heard it, a faint thud, like something falling or being moved, coming from the second floor. I froze for a moment, listening intently. Another thud, louder this time. I radioed in, letting dispatch know I was investigating noises inside the house. Backup was at least 20 minutes away, so I had to proceed alone. The staircase was narrow and steep, and the steps creaked under my weight. Reaching the top, I found myself in a hallway with 3 doors, 2 were closed, and 1 was slightly ajar. The thuds had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I checked the first room. It was empty, just an old bedroom with a rusted bed frame and a broken dresser. The second room was the same, dust and decay, nothing else. That left the third room, the one with the door ajar. I approached slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. Pushing the door open with my flashlight, I shone the beam inside. The room was nearly empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair was an old rotary phone, the kind you don't see anymore. Its receiver was off the hook, dangling by the cord. I walked closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air behind me, like someone was standing there. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. And then, the phone rang. The shrill sound shattered the silence, making my heart race. I stared at the phone, hesitating for a moment before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. There was no response. Just static, faint but unmistakable. "Who is this?" I demanded. Still nothing. But then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It said, "Leave." That was enough for me. I hung up the phone and backed out of the room, my flashlight shaking slightly. I didn't bother searching the rest of the house. I made my way downstairs, out the front door, and back to my patrol car. Backup arrived shortly after, and we searched the house top to bottom. We found no one, no evidence that anyone had been there. Even the phone upstairs was disconnected, no power, no working line. To this day, I don't know who made that 911 call or what I experienced in that house. But every time I drive past that gravel road, I feel the same unease I felt that night. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you find, it's what you can't explain. My name is James Holloway. In my years as a police officer, I've learned that the quietest nights are often the ones that leave you the most unsettled. It's not the chaos that gets to you, it's the stillness, the sense that something is just off. One night, during a routine patrol, I had an experience that I still can't fully explain. It was a cold winter evening, just after 3 a.m., and the streets were completely deserted. I was assigned to the night shift in a small town surrounded by farmland and wooded hills. The kind of place where people wave when you pass by, and crime usually means a missing dog or a minor dispute over property lines. I was driving along a stretch of rural road that connected the town to the highway. The road was flanked by dense trees on both sides, their bare branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The snow from earlier that evening had stopped, leaving a thick, undisturbed layer of white on the ground. My radio had been silent for nearly an hour when dispatch suddenly called in. A motorist had reported seeing a person walking along the road several miles ahead. In weather this cold, anyone walking out there in the middle of the night was cause for concern. I acknowledged the call and drove to the location. The road was dark, the only light coming from my headlights, which reflected off the snow in a cold, bluish hue. After a few minutes, I saw what looked like footprints in the snow on the shoulder of the road. They were faint, as if whoever had made them was moving lightly or had passed by some time ago. Slowing down, I scanned the area. About 200 yards ahead, my headlights caught a figure walking on the side of the road. They were wearing a long coat, the hood pulled up, and their gait was slow, almost mechanical. I stopped the car a short distance behind them and turned on my spotlight, illuminating the figure. "Police? Are you okay?" I called out through the loudspeaker. The person didn't respond. They didn't even turn around, just kept walking at the same slow, deliberate pace. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of snow beneath my boots breaking the silence. "Hey! Stop for a moment, I need to talk to you." The figure finally stopped but didn't turn to face me. They stood there, motionless, their back to me. The air was freezing, and my breath formed clouds in front of me as I approached. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" I asked, keeping my flashlight trained on them. Still no response. Just silence. Something about the way they stood there, so still, so unresponsive, put me on edge. I moved closer, about 10 feet away, and repeated my question. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no footprints leading to where they were standing. The only tracks in the snow were mine and the ones I had seen earlier, which stopped several feet behind them. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around," I said, my voice firm. Slowly, they turned, but their face was hidden by the shadow of the hood. My flashlight didn't seem to penetrate the darkness under it, which didn't make any sense. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. Before I could say anything else, the figure suddenly turned back and started walking into the woods. I called out for them to stop, but they didn't acknowledge me. I followed for a few steps, shining my flashlight into the trees, but the figure seemed to disappear into the shadows. I radioed for backup and waited by my car, scanning the area with my spotlight. When my partner arrived, we searched the woods together, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbances in the snow, nothing. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. We never found out who, or what, I encountered that night. The footprints on the road didn't match up with where they had been standing, and there was no logical explanation for how they disappeared so quickly. Even now, every time I drive that stretch of road, I find myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see that figure again. It's the kind of experience that makes you question what you think you know about the world, and leaves you with more questions than answers. My name is Daniel Foster. When you work as a police officer in a rural area, you quickly learn to expect the unexpected. Most of the time, it's just mundane stuff, a car off the road, a call about a missing cow, or maybe a neighborly dispute. But every now and then, you encounter something that sticks with you, something that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. This happened on a particularly quiet night about 5 years ago. I was working the overnight shift in a small, wooded township. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and any unusual activity feels magnified. It was just after 1 a.m. when dispatch called. A local had reported strange noises coming from a dirt road on the outskirts of town. They didn't say much, just that they'd been walking their dog and heard what sounded like a scream, followed by a sort of whistling noise. The caller wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else, but thought it was worth reporting. I was the closest unit, so I responded. The road in question was unpaved, winding through dense woods with no houses for miles. As I turned onto it, the beam of my headlights illuminated the towering trees, their branches casting long, spindly shadows across the path. About a mile in, I rolled down my window to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the faint rustle of wind in the trees. I turned off the engine and stepped out, the silence almost suffocating. And then, I heard it. A high-pitched whistle, distant but clear. It sounded almost human, but there was something unnatural about it, like it was coming from deep in the woods. My first thought was that it might be someone playing a prank, but at this hour, in this weather, it didn't make sense. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. The forest was dense, and the beam of my light barely penetrated the darkness. I called out, "Police! Is anyone out there?" My voice echoed briefly before being swallowed by the trees. No response. The whistling stopped, replaced by a low rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I couldn't pinpoint its direction, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I radioed in my location and let dispatch know I was investigating on foot. Backup was at least 30 minutes away, so I had no choice but to keep moving. As I pushed further into the woods, the rustling grew louder, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was circling me. My flashlight beam darted back and forth, but all I could see were trees and shadows. And then, I saw it. About 20 yards ahead, something was crouched low to the ground. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a large dog, but as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a person. They were wearing tattered clothes, their back to me, and they were completely still. I called out, "Sir, are you hurt? Do you need assistance?" No reaction. I took a cautious step closer, and that's when they moved. Slowly, unnaturally, they turned their head to the side, not to look at me, but almost like they were listening for something. The movement was so strange, so deliberate, that I froze. Before I could say anything else, they stood up abruptly and bolted into the woods. The speed was shocking, almost inhuman. I chased after them, my flashlight bouncing wildly, but they disappeared into the darkness within seconds. I stopped, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woods were silent again, as if nothing had ever been there. When backup finally arrived, we searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of the person or any tracks leading deeper into the forest. Even the spot where I'd seen them crouching showed no evidence that anyone had been there. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night. But every time I drive past that dirt road, I feel a pang of unease, a lingering sense that something out there isn't quite right. And the whistling? I haven't heard it since, but sometimes, when the night is quiet, I think I can almost hear it in the back of my mind. Stories like these remind us that not everything can be explained. Sometimes, the most unsettling experiences aren't about what we see, but what we feel, the lingering unease, the unanswered questions. Whether it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, one thing is certain: the unknown has a way of staying with us. Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments, what do you think really happened that night?